Thanks for sticking around, and this is part two of our interview with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, and we certainly appreciate you sticking around.
Speaking of Putin and Trump negotiating with Putin, Craig, one thing that I'm still trying to make heads and tails of was the announcement, I guess, about a week and a half ago that Putin made that he was going to pull the Russian military out of Syria. And we were wondering what your take is on that, or if you can help us make some sense of it.
Well, yes, this is a brilliant stroke, in my view. Putin has done, he's had just one amazing, brilliant stroke after the other. You may remember it was last September, I think on the 28th, at the UN meeting, and Putin said that we can no longer tolerate the state of affairs in the world. 2 days later, he's taken over the war against ISIS. This caught everybody off guard. 5 months later, he's completely destroyed the Islamic State as a military force. They can no longer put an army in the field. All of their financing is destroyed. He destroyed their oil sales to Turkey. All their arms depots that we provided them have been destroyed. At best now, there's some kind of isolated terrorist. So he says that's what he intended to do. It's done. Now, look, we've been trying to do this for 15 years against somebody and never succeeded in 5 months. And he says, okay, and this is what he said. He says, we have established the conditions for peace. We hope the parties involved show common sense. If not, he says if Washington or other parties to this agreement abuse these conditions, quote, Russia can, in several hours, build up its forces in Syria to a size capable of dealing with an escalating situation and use the entire range of means at its disposal. So he said, you know, it only takes us several hours. We're back. So we hope you show common sense. Now, what the neocons have tried to do, they've tried to say that Putin's withdrawal, oh, see, he's weak, he's pulling out. Well, that's not what Putin said. He didn't say anything like that. He said, okay, we've created, the exact quote, we have created the conditions for peace in Syria. We hope the parties involved would show common sense. If Washington abuses these conditions, Russia can, in several hours, build up its forces in Syria to a size capable of dealing with an escalating situation and use the entire range of means at its disposal. Our uncompromising attitude to terrorism remains unchanged. So, you know, what else does he need to say? I think with the rise of Russia, this is another good thing to be hopeful about, because it means there's now a constraint on American unilateralism. It won't be as easy for Washington, for the neocons in Washington, for the military security complex to keep their federal monies flowing into their profits. It won't be as easy now for them to go set up some country for attack. You remember now, it was Putin that blocked the attack on Syria.
Yes.
It was Putin who blocked the attack on Iran. And so this is the reason that the neocons hate him so much. It's the reason for Ukraine. But of course, the policy we launched in Ukraine has failed as well.
he kind of diffused that. I mean, he couldn't prevent it, but he went in and took Crimea back, and he kind of diffused what the U.S. was doing over there.
That's right. And of course, Ukraine is in complete chaos politically, economically. And now the Europeans are saying, good God, are we going to end up responsible for Ukraine when we've got massive unemployment? We're overrun with millions of refugees from America's wars. And now America has given us Ukraine to take care of. You see what Putin is really doing. His pulling out of Syria is true on its face, but it also has the purpose of reassuring Europe that he's not an occupying power. He's not trying to build an empire. He's solved the problem and left. And now go ahead, make the peace. Here you have. I've given you the opportunity. So the Europeans are starting to see that this is the real leader. He doesn't have evil intentions against them or anybody else. And he's banking on Europe disengaging from Washington's control and becoming a real independent power, or having independent foreign policy and independent economic policy, of ceasing to be a conduit for Washington.
Want the individual nation states of Europe have to disengage from NATO?
Yes. Yes.
How would that be accomplished?
Either they will disengage or they will use NATO to control Washington. They'll just say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. Here's the vote. It's, you can't know for sure, but of course, this will require more leadership from the Europeans. And it may be the pressure that Marine Le Pen and Farage and others are putting on the traditional parties will force the traditional parties to break connections, or at least some of them, with Washington and actually start to represent Europeans. You see, Cameron, Merkel, Hollande, they don't represent the British, the Germans, the French. They represent Washington. That's who they represent. And so if the pressure from the failure of Washington's policies, that particularly the two that have given them millions of refugees and the potential of a deadly conflict with Russia, you can't put Europe in worse condition than Washington has put them in. And so now if they're faced with a rise in alternative parties, then the establishments have to decide whether they go down with the ship or do they change to stay in control. And so they may start preempting Marine Le Pen, they may start preempting Farage by starting to talk independently of Washington. And they may have to do that for survival, in which case then Putin has achieved the aim. He's busted up the American empire. The neocons can no longer run around talking about American hegemony over the world, the exceptional, indispensable people who are not bound by international law or any kind of law, just by our will, our power, the God-chosen people. All of this disappears. And I think that's what he's really playing for. He would rather have the situation resolved in that way than to come to military blows, because he knows that with nuclear weapons, there's nobody survives. It's just, people think that because if you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki today, that these weapons aren't that damaging because you've got two great massive cities there. The thing is, the atomic bombs are minute compared to the hydrogen bombs. And the current thermonuclear weapons are about 17,000 times more powerful than the ones we used on Japan. And so it doesn't take very many of those just to wipe out vast quantities of people, in fact, to make life unlivable. I mean, just look at all the trouble that's coming from the failure of one nuclear plant, Fukushima. Just look at that. I mean, this is just one nuclear plant that fails. Now imagine if you had all these weapons used in some way. A lot of scientists have said that if the United States or Russia used only 10% of its current arsenal, that life on Earth would cease to exist. So, you know, Putin's very much aware of that. He doesn't talk about winning nuclear wars. Like the idiots in Washington talking about winning nuclear wars. And this crazy William Crystal that runs around saying, what's the use of nuclear weapons if you can't use them? So I think that if you put all this in context, you see that Putin realizes that the United States, under control and influence of the neoconservatives and the just homegrown American hubris and arrogance, is a threat to life on Earth. And that Russia is not prepared to become a vassal to avoid this threat and has to defeat it, but in a peaceful way. And that's what his policy is. And that's what we see him doing over and over. When the Ukraine coup happened and went crazy, Russia could have taken Ukraine in probably 2 days. Why didn't he do it? I mean, Ukraine couldn't have done anything about it if the Russian army came in there. He could have hung all of the puppets we appointed. Probably 48 hours, 76 hours. The whole thing would have been over with. He could have said, well, not just Crimea has come back to Russia, but Ukraine. It's been with us for 300 years. The Americans tricked us out of it when the Soviet Union collapsed, but it's now back where it belongs, and nobody would have done anything. Why didn't he do that? He didn't do it because he knew it would play into the American propaganda with the Europeans. And he's more interested in busting up American control of Europe than he is in taking Ukraine back. So he's left it there, and he handles it in a way that increasingly points out that the Americans have created a huge problem for Europe by organizing the coup in Ukraine. So as long as you have somebody that capable, see, my fear is that the CIA is working overtime to come up with a way to assassinate Putin, because he is clearly a major danger to American control of the world. And particularly now that the Russians and the Chinese are in a strategic alliance. I mean, you know, really, if you think about it, the United States is not a match for the combination of Russia and China. So all of this can work to encourage political leadership in the West, not just in Europe, but here. We could see a change, and we could see 1% removed from the control that it hasn't had since the robber barons in the Roaring '20s. And we could see a return of the kinds of regulation that makes capitalism workable for everybody and not just for the 1%. And if we don't get that, we're basically finished as a country.
If the CIA were to take out Putin, wouldn't Lavrov and Medvedev, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, wouldn't they step in to that void and immediately align with China and immediately come after the United States, NATO, through Europe? Or how would that?
I think not, Rory. I don't think so. Well, first of all, we would blame it on some Chechen terrorist, you know, that the Russians put down. We would blame it on that. And all the Western press would say that. Would all, oh, it was this Chechen terrorist, Chechen terrorist. The Russians might know different, but do they want a nuclear confrontation over it? Because as much damage as they can do to us, what do you gain if everybody's dead. So it's unlikely that they would strike back in anger. Also, within Russia itself, there is a rump part of the political establishment that reports to Washington. They're known as the Atlanticist integrationists. These are the westernized members of the Russian upper crust that desire to be part of the West, who look to the West for approval and who are opposed to the Russian nationalists that Putin represents. And Medvedev, according to the Sinker, is one of them. So that the prime minister in Russia is actually aligned with the Atlanticist integrationists who want Russia absorbed into the Western world. So if a strong leader like Putin is removed, the chance of those people or that faction to make deals and remove the Russian constraint on American hegemony, that is a real problem. It seems to me that you could end up with a political civil war internally. The Russian nationalists would have to strike very quick and arrest all those people, or the opposite could happen. So I think that it would be a huge setback in the prospect for humanity for Putin to be assassinated. But I'm absolutely convinced that the CIA is working on it. It's impossible that they wouldn't be. I mean, we just don't put up with people who get in our way. Look what happens every time South America elects a reformer and he tries to have the resources of the country used in some way for the advantage of the indigenous population and not for Wall Street or the banana companies or the timber companies or the oil company, all the foreign ones, or for the elite Spanish ruling class that reports to Washington. What happens to them? They either get overthrown or assassinated. As the whole record shows that, not one of them. You know, Obama and Hillary overthrew the president of Honduras in 2009. He was a reformist. He said, okay, we have to have a government that represents, instead of the United Fruit Company, it represents people who live in Honduras. Boom, he's gone. Look what happened to Chavez. You have to remember he was overthrown, right?
Right.
And it was the military and the people who went to the streets and made us turn loose of him before we could kill him. And they put him back in office. Well, look now what's happening. We're overthrowing his successor. Maduro is in the process of being overthrown.
Plus, we took their gold.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think we put sanctions on them as well. And now look what's happened to Carrera in Ecuador. Carrera is the one who gave asylum to Julian Assange, right?
Yep.
Now, when Carrera came in, he evicted the American air base. He said there would be no oil concessions to foreign oil companies in the Ecuadorian rainforest. He took other measures that were blocking the ability of American firms to exploit the country. So what did we do? We had overthrown so many people or killed them that this time we sicked the Ecuadorian police on him. So the Ecuadorian police, led by a graduate of the School of the Americas, that's where we train our people that we send back to Latin America to oversee things. The Ecuadorian police exercised a coup against Carrera, but it was blocked by the military. But Carrera got the message. We hope the parties involved would show common sense. If Washington abuses these conditions, Russia can, in several hours, build up its forces in Syria to a size capable of dealing with an escalating situation and use the entire range of means at its disposal. Our uncompromising attitude to terrorism remains unchanged. So,
That's serious.
What else does he need to say? I think with the rise of Russia, this is another good thing to be hopeful about, because it means there's now a constraint. Putin has done, he's had just one amazing, brilliant stroke after the other. You may remember it was last September, I think on the 28th, at the UN meeting, and Putin said that we can no longer tolerate the state of affairs in the world. 2 days later, he's taken over the war against ISIS. This caught everybody off guard. 5 months later, he's completely destroyed the Islamic State as a military force. They can no longer put an army in the field. All of their financing is destroyed. He destroyed their oil sales to Turkey. All their arms depots that we provided them have been destroyed. At best now, there's some kind of isolated terrorist. So he says that's what he intended to do. It's done. Now, look, we've been trying to do this for 15 years against somebody and never succeeded in 5 months. And he says, okay, and this is what he said. He says, we have established the conditions for peace. We hope the parties involved show common sense. If not, he says if Washington or other parties to this agreement abuse these conditions, quote, Russia can, in several hours, build up its forces in Syria to a size capable of dealing with an escalating situation and use the entire range of means at its disposal. So he said, it only takes us several hours. We're back. So we hope you show common sense. Now, what the neocons have tried to do, they've tried to say that Putin's withdrawal, oh, see, he's weak, he's pulling out. Well, that's not what Putin said. He didn't say anything like that. He said, okay, we've created, the exact quote, we have created the conditions for peace in Syria.
Thanks for sticking around, and this is part 2 of our interview with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, and we certainly appreciate you sticking around.
Speaking of Putin and Trump negotiating with Putin, Craig, one thing that I'm still trying to make heads and tails of was the announcement, I guess about a week and a half ago, that Putin made that he was going to pull the Russian military out of Syria. And we were wondering what your take is on that, or if you can help us make some sense of it.
Well, yes, this is a brilliant stroke, in my view.